It is not actually possible to cover everything in regards to DP-600 in 45 minutes. It's too much information. So I took a little bit of a different approach to this session. We are not covering every single item that is within the DP-600. And instead, I'm trying to give you kind of views of how certain topics within the DP-600 link together. So then you have something to hold on to as you go into the more exact topics. So since I got the slides up and going, I'll just get going here and just start with a little intro. So if we think about the DP-600, it is of course all about fabric. And the interesting thing about fabric is that we have all these countless experiences, and in each experience we have also their own items that we create, and they all have their specific features and capabilities that they offer. So if we think about the fact that DP-600 is about all of this, well, that can feel really overwhelming because it's a lot of ground to cover. There is many details to each of these experiences that can make it difficult to really wrap your head around at what do you need to know and what do you not need to know. So that is really the main goal for today, to figure out what do you need to know and what can you maybe disregard for this particular exam. You might need to and want to learn it for yourself, for your work, for example, but you might not need it for the exam specifically. Because we actually have tools for that to know what is included in the exam and what is not. So we'll first start off today by looking at the high-level skills that are measured for this particular exam. What kind of topics do you need to cover? Then we'll kind of dive in and again kind of look at clusters of knowledge that you need to learn for this particular exam and kind of help you then maybe have a starting point to which you can then build on. And then lastly, I'll share just a few quick tips on both resources that you can then use to go on from here, but also just tips on how can you prepare for the exam in the best way possible, because there are some strategies that you can use to ensure that you're able to get through that exam in a good way. So before we head first into the skills, I'll just give a short intro of myself. I'm based in Finland and I work for a small Finnish company called Polar Squad. I'm a DevOps consultant, but I approach the data topics from this DevOps and architecture perspective, I would say. And yes, you might have seen me. I think it was a little choppy, the video earlier today for the Knee Deep in Tech podcast. I'm one of the hosts there as well. And as you might have already been able to know, I'm a bit of a serial doodler. That's how I kind of structure things in my mind. So there is quite many of those ahead today as well. I think that might have been why I almost crashed PowerPoint right before this session. It took a second go before it got going properly. But since I do not have that much time for this session and there's a lot of ground to cover, let's first hop into just looking at the high-level skills that are required for this exam. So of course we are talking about the DP-600, and it means that, well, this is the Fabric Analytics Engineer certification that this heads to, but the exam itself is actually called Implementing Analytics Solutions using Microsoft Fabric. So all of these skills that we're measuring for this are related to building an analytics solution in Fabric. And that then kind of gives you that Fabric Analytics Engineer certification for yourself. There is 4 high-level categories that are covered in the exam. The very first one is planning, implementing, and managing a solution for data analytics. I kind of took that end out just to make it a little more concise. This is actually the smallest bit of the exam. It's only 10 to 15%, but it contains quite a bit of very relevant information about the platform itself that we should be familiar with. So it's, even though it's percentage-wise a little smaller, it is quite important as well for the exam itself. And it's kind of one of those areas that if you know it well, it also makes the other areas actually easier to understand. The second area is prepare and serve data, and this is the bulk of the exam. So this has to do very much how do we move data around, how do we transform it, how do we get it into the format that we want to serve it in, and what are the different methods of serving as well. Then the third area that was the most hazy for me before I started looking into Fabric is this implementing and managing semantic models. And that is just because I have not worked in Power BI so much, but since we're now looking at Fabric, Power BI is of course a very important part of Fabric. And so it means that it is part of the DP-600 exam as well, and a very important one of it. So it's a fifth or to a quarter of the exam itself. So if you're like me and don't have so much Power BI background, be prepared to kind of catch up on that. It is mainly focusing on the semantic model side. There is not so much on the reporting itself, as we'll see in a moment, but the semantic model is emphasized quite heavily, and how do you actually do modeling on that level. The fourth area here is explore and analyze data. Even though this is 20 to 25% of the exam as well, this is the most light, I would say, in terms of the requirements, but it is something that where you would draw in from the experience of the other portions to kind of put that together for yourself. So the area itself doesn't have so many technical details than the other areas, but it is more about how do you then put that to use and make an implementation. So there is a question in the chat. There is a lot of free material out there I will share in the very end of the session. So there are some free courses that are really well put together that you can use. At the moment, there isn't a code for the exam available, but there is periodically Microsoft does have these challenges available where you can get an exam voucher. It's normally 50% that you can get. And the last I checked, they were saying early for all, there should be a new challenge coming along. So you can kind of check that out at that point as well. So the other important aspect, if we think about these different areas, is how do these map to the different components of Fabric? So in the plan, implement, and manage area, that is mainly about the Fabric platform itself, about how do you configure it, how do you choose the services you use, and things like that. So there's a lot of information about just general knowledge that you need to know about Fabric to be able to get going. There is also some little things about Power BI. They're quite small and simple, so they're kind of lightweight things that you can find in the requirements. There is also some aspects about the data factory side of Fabric as well, with pipelines and data flows that are included in this area. But very much about the platform itself, that is the main focus in this area. The preparing and serving of the data, that goes more into detail into the different experiences and the data stores that we have now become familiar with in Fabric. So for example, this dives into data engineering and lakehouses. It dives into data warehousing in the warehouse side. And then, of course, if we talk about the two of those, we need to talk about one lake. And then, of course, we need to talk about data movement as well. If we are preparing data, then we come back to the data factory side over here as well. So we kind of really cover the core components within Fabric in this particular area. For me, this currently says that looks like something went wrong. I'm wondering if anyone can hear me. Oh, you can hear me. Great. Because for me, everything was paused for a moment. Sorry for waiting around. I think I had a little glitch there. So as we get to the third area, this is 100% about Power BI and semantic models, a little about actually also external tools to Fabric and how you work with semantic models, a little bit about how we connect that with other services in Fabric as well, but mainly Power BI capabilities. And then the explore and analyze data, that is very much focused on the data engineering and the data warehousing side as well. So if we look at the scope of this, we can right away see that there is actually no real-time intelligence here in these requirements. So currently that is not part of the exam. We'll see if it comes in at some point. There is also no mention of data activator. So that is also not part of the exam. So right away we have like, whew, okay, we can scratch something out of the picture and kind of focus on the core areas that are required for the exam itself. So really keeping this in mind can help you kind of focus on what aspects do you need to learn. And then it doesn't maybe feel quite so huge of area to cover when we know what areas of Fabric are included and what not. The one additional aspect is, of course, once we dive more into the detail, we will see kind of more exactly what kind of the requirements are. And especially going through those, then you're able to see more where are the areas where you need to focus as you dive into those areas. So with that, we're going to do exactly that. We are going to dive in to those 4 categories and kind of get some handles in all of them to get you going and get you started on heading for the DP-600. So we're going to start from the first one, which is the plan, implement, and manage. So as said, this is mainly focused on the Fabric platform itself. So if we look at the requirements that can be found from the exam material itself, I will actually give a quick look here for you. So there is the certification page that you can find online. And if you go to this, you can find a lot of material, but at the bottom there is this link to exam DP-600 study guide. And if you go here, you can find a list of skills measured. It will also give you kind of what are the main areas, as you can see. There are specific Fabric components that are included in this exam itself. So you don't need to know everything in Fabric in this case. And then we kind of go into all of those areas here as well. So we'll kind of start diving into that entire page here as we go on. So the very first kind of subcategory within this plan, implement, and manage area is Plan A data analytics environment. And this has to do with figuring out the requirements for your organization. How do you structure Fabric? How do you organize your workspaces? How do you set up your capacities as well? And what are kind of the tenant level settings that you might configure? There is some very, like, I would say, specific requirements here. Those I will be actually the ones that I will be skipping today, because those are the ones that it's easy to find information for. It is the more vague ones that are a little kind of harder to gather. So those are the ones that I will be focusing on today. So for example, I won't be going into the data gateway types or the creating a custom Power BI report theme. I will share a link in the end for example, for one blog post where there are links for each of these areas listed. So that is a really easy resource to use for kind of going into those very specific technical details. The first requirement here, for example, identifying requirements for a solution, including components, features, performance, and capacity. That is much more vague and kind of complex question there. So that is where we will be mainly focusing today in this area. There is a second subcategory, and this has to do with kind of managing the workspaces themselves. So there is one aspect about access control and setting up access control, as well as sharing workspace items. Then there is the sensitivity labels, and then kind of configuring the workspace settings and things like that are included here. But again, we are kind of like looking at Fabric as a whole and understanding how do we manage the workspaces themselves. And then the third area has to do with the development lifecycle. So this is, for example, how do we implement version control for a workspace, but also looking at the Power BI development lifecycle as well, and how do the different formats that we have available there kind of differ from each other. There is also sometimes you can find in the requirements something that is not very technical. So for example, perform impact analysis on downstream dependencies from lakehouses, data warehouses, data flows, and semantic models. So that is something much more general. There's some things that help for that, but they are kind of not a specific technical detail as some of these requirements are. So that is what covers this 10 to 15%. To me, it looks like quite a bit to fit into 10 to 15%. So you're not going to get questions about everything in this list. But if you were to go through this list and kind of ensure you have at least basic level knowledge of every single item, you would be in a very good place to get going for this. But we're kind of going to start from the planning a data analytics environment side and kind of figuring out which components and features you would use in Fabric, just to set the ground. I will present this in a little bit of a different way than we often view at Fabric. So just to get a new kind of perspective of how you can look at Fabric. So oftentimes you see that image of Fabric where you have all the different experiences, data engineering and things like that. And you can kind of know maybe already on a high level what each of those are for. So I will look at it now kind of more from the capability perspective. So for example, we will, for a data platform solution, especially a modern data platform solution, we will need some capabilities there. And we will need some kind of storage layer. We will need some kind of metastore layer that defines our tables and schemas and so forth. We will need some kind of compute, and we will need some kind of orchestration to be able to move our data around. So if we start from the storage layer in Fabric, that of course is OneLake. That is where all of our data is stored in data lake format, and whatever experience we use, that is kind of the centralized data storage location that is behind the scenes. On the metastore layer is where things get really interesting, in my opinion. So we have the lakehouse option, and we have the warehouse option. The lakehouse is mainly the data engineering and data science experiences, and the warehouse is more focused on the data warehousing experience. They are a little different, and we'll look at those differences a little more in detail as we go on. For the lakehouse, we are mainly using Spark Compute, and there is the Spark runtime behind the scenes that we use. And since Spark is a platform that also runs outside of Fabric, all of that is very stable and runs really well. And the capabilities of Spark are available to us within Fabric. And the warehousing side, that is much more a newer compute capability that we have available. So there we have warehouse capacity behind the scenes, as we are on a SaaS platform with Fabric. With Spark and warehouse capacities, we don't really need to manage those. We don't need to install anything or anything like that. We have some configuration we can do, but those are mainly managed for us behind the scenes. So what is interesting in Fabric is that the lakehouse metastore layer is very much tied to the Spark compute. So that is what we would use to query that and work with that data and write data and so forth. And on the other hand, the warehouse side is very much tied to the specific capacity that it uses behind the scenes. So we cannot kind of disentangle those from each other. On the orchestration side, we have kind of the data warehousing, data factory capabilities of pipelines, but remember it's not exactly the same as in Fabric or Synapse, but a very similar experience. But we also have data flows available that give us another very no-code, low-code experience that we can use to do our transformations on our data. There is actually also a third track that I won't go into detail because that is not covered in the exam, but it's just good to know how it would fit into this perspective of looking at the capabilities. So this is the streaming side. So over there, we have the Metastore is handled by the event house, and then the KQL databases within it that you create. Behind the scenes, there is a Custo engine that enables us to run those Custo queries. And then there is the event streams that are able to ingest data as events or streams, whether it's IoT data or event-based data from an application, for example. And so kind of these stacks that we have now in this picture link to the different experiences that we have within Fabric. So the Spark Compute and Lakehouse with OneLake, they connect to the data engineering. The warehouse capacity and warehouses connect, of course, to the data warehousing. And then there is the real-time intelligence on the left with the event streams and Custo engine and event houses as well. And actually, the data science side also leverages very much of the Spark Compute and Lakehouses and everything that comes along with that. So that kind of helps us understand what kind of capabilities there are in a data platform nowadays, not just Fabric. There are similar structures in other data platforms, and this helps us understand what kind of capabilities the different Fabric components give and kind of bring to the table once we start creating solutions there. The other angle that we need to look at what Fabric from is kind of understanding the hierarchies that we need when we create our Fabric environment. So if we kind of start from the base, we have the Fabric tenant, which is the organization level hierarchy. And this is kind of something that you don't see that much. We see it in certain things that we'll come to in a moment. But this kind of gets created for you by default when you sign up for Fabric with your organization account. Then you have your organization has a Fabric tenant. Within a Fabric tenant, things are organized by workspaces. So you would structure your projects within different workspaces. And you might want to kind of think about before the exam, like how would you structure them? Why would you separate them to different workspaces and so forth? And what kind of benefits do you have from that? On the tenant level, we have some specific tenant settings. So for example, there is still a setting in the tenant level that you can either enable Fabric capabilities or disable them from the entire tenant, or you could also target that to a specific group or to everybody except a specific group. So we always have those options when we are setting the tenant level settings. But on the other hand, while those tenant settings are very much organization level, on the other hand, we also have settings for the workspaces for each workspace specifically. So that means that we can have both control at the organization level, but also toggle the settings how we wish for each of those workspaces. If we need more control in one place or another, then those workspace settings make it possible for us. And as said, for the tenant settings, there is always these options to assign them to a specific group. So for example, in the tenant settings, there is also all the preview features. You can enable them or not. So you can enable them for a single group. You can enable them for the entire organization, or you can exclude a specific group from those tenant settings. And I recommend you to check kind of at least on the high level that what kind of settings are on the tenant level, because there could be, for example, a question in the exam about, is this a workspace level setting or is this a tenant level setting or things like that? Or how do you enable something specific? And there could be options on that. To actually be able to set the tenant settings, one needs to have admin rights to Fabric. And there is a specific Fabric admin role that can be given to a user or a group. But also, if in your organization you have global admins in your Entra, those people are also Fabric admins. And then also, if you have Power Platform admins, those will then automatically be Fabric admins as well. Also, of course, for every single workspace, there is some access options as well, different kinds of roles that we can give people. And those roles are an admin role. Note, it's a workspace admin, not a tenant admin. There is a member and there's a contributor. And these go now in the order of like most privileges to least privileges here. So the admin is somebody who can update or delete the workspace. They can also add or remove people, also other admins. So those are kind of the specific roles that they have. And in addition, they have everything that the members and the contributors have as well. So they can see all the items in the workspace, they can manage all the items, they can remove them, and so forth. So admin role is quite wide, especially since they're also able to remove the entire workspace as well. So use that carefully, but you should have probably more than one admin. The member title was a little confusing to me because to my mind, that sounds like that is lower than a contributor. I don't know why, but the member can actually add other members and anyone with lower permissions, and also allow others to reshare items in that workspace. So those are the workspace level roles. The contributor can still see everything in the workspace. So if we need limited access within the workspace, we cannot, to a specific item, we cannot use the contributor role because that gives access to everything in the workspace. And for that, we might need to use sometimes item level roles. And of course, the best principle is always to use groups for this. If we are assigning the different roles, create groups based on roles and then assign them to those groups. So you don't have to manage individual people. And so let's say we have another workspace and we just want to give access to a specific lakehouse. We could then give permissions to that specific item level to a group as well. So if we need limited access within the workspace itself. And since we have all of these users and groups, and I even mentioned the global admin, it's good to remember that behind the scenes, the authentication is handled by Entra ID. So that is the ensuring that you are who you claim you are. And then the authorization part is what is handled by Fabric, kind of ensuring, are you able to see a specific item? Can you do something specific in a workspace and so forth? Those are kind of the things that are handled at that level. On the workspace level, that is also where you can configure Git settings. With that, ensure that you are aware which items support and which not. That is kind of in constant change. So make sure that you know what are actually supported for that and which capabilities will be covered by that specific area. So now if we go to our original list, we've kind of touched on a few of these topics. As you see, there's still a few topics left. So I encourage you to go to those specifically. They're more maybe well-defined, so it will be easier to find responses to those. And hopefully this helps you to get going in these particular topics. But we are on to the second area since timing is running really, really fast. So this is the preparing and serving data. Again, we have some subcategories. We have, we need to know how to work with lakehouses and warehouses. How do we ingest data? What kind of things can we do in those? In lakehouses, the shortcuts, and then views, functions, and stored procedures in the warehouse side. Then we also need to know how to copy data, what are our options there, and so forth. Which one would we choose and when? Then we need to know how to transform data. In this area, we should be familiar with using star schemas and know the different types of slowly changing dimensions. We should also know how to create bridge tables in a lakehouse or a warehouse. And then we should be kind of familiar with denormalization of data as well, and all of these different transformations that can be done with both PySpark in this data engineering side and SQL in the data warehousing side. And then lastly, we have optimizing performance. So being able to optimize if you have any issues in your queries and things like that. So we'll kind of take a look at some of these topics again. We are not able to cover all of them here. So as we get into these, I'll kind of try to tie a few of those topics in and how they kind of relate to each other. So you're again able to make a little bit of those connections there that you might need to. So of course, as we talk about the different experiences, the main thing is that we are, of course, storing our data in one lake. That is the common denominator. Let's see if my slide allows to change here. There's a little shortcut that has gotten there, but don't worry about that. We'll come to it. So we have the data warehousing side where we create a warehouse that is organized into schemas. And then within those schemas is where you create your tables, where your data is stored. So that is kind of the one experience that we're able to use to store our data. In the data engineering side, on the other hand, we would be using a lakehouse, as has been already mentioned. And within a lakehouse, we have kind of these different file structures that we are looking at. So we have this files folder that is visible to us, and then a tables folder. And depending on how we work on our data, it will be in one or the other. And it's a good idea to get familiar with that structure as well. When you create a lakehouse, you also end up with a SQL endpoint. So you can actually use SQL to query your data in a lakehouse as well. And then you also get a semantic model. If you happen to attend the previous long session, there was quite a bit of information about this and specific tooling, but a lot of that is not covered actually in the exam. So when you create these different metastores, the lakehouses and warehouses, there are structures that are created into the one lake. So there is kind of a folder that gets created or a container that gets created for each workspace where you have data. And then if you, for example, create a lakehouse, that gets its own folder. If you create a warehouse, that gets its own folder. And then, for example, within a lakehouse, you have that files subfolder and also the tables subfolder as well. And of course, then there can be subfolders within each of those. So we have this one lake structure that gets created behind the scenes as well. One of the really cool capabilities within Fabric is that we are able to also make shortcuts to other data, whether it's in Fabric or outside of it. So the Fabric is, so to speak, in one lake, but you can create these in the lakehouse side. So for example, if you wanted to create a shortcut from some other item in one lake, you could create it with a shortcut and have that available in your lakehouse directly. You don't have to do this if you have your warehouse and lakehouse in the same workspace, but if they were in separate ones, you would actually need to create a shortcut to be able to also work on that data in your warehouse with the lakehouse capabilities. But on the other hand, yes, we are able to create this one lake and Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 accounts, shortcuts, but there's actually other options as well. So we are also able to create this to S3s in Amazon or S3 compatible storage layers. So there's a lot of these out there that are actually S3 compatible. And the shortcuts also have now brought the support for this. And this also has the support for the Google Cloud Storage as well. So really cool. You don't necessarily need to move your data around to be able to reference it in your Fabric workspace. And the lower options here also now have the option to configure this for on-prem sources. But of course, then you need to have a gateway in place to be able to reach that data source as well. If we look at the warehouse side, over there is where we would then create the different views, functions, and stored procedures that we might need for our solution as well. So those kind of fall on that side of the fence as well from the requirements. So something that is very common is while we are working with warehouses and lake houses is that we need to transform our data. And on the data engineering side, we are mainly using notebooks to work with, for example, PySpark or Spark SQL and so forth. And then on the warehousing side, we are using SQL to do those same things. And there were several things listed in the requirements, like joins, aggregations, filters, and data typecasting, that we should become familiar on how to do them both on the notebooks as well as with the SQL syntax. And note, we could use the SQL to query data on the warehouse side or query the data through the SQL endpoint on the lakehouse side as well. So that is an option there as well. Even when we're working with these transformations, for the notebooks, there is also a simple like scheduling capability there that you are able to use if you do need to do very, very simple scheduling. Of course, we have other tooling in Fabric to actually do data movement, if that is more in line with what you need to do, which is actually more likely that that is the case. So since time is going really, really fast, I will do a little bit of a shortcut here, but I will just give a few details about the copying of data. So of course, if we look at the copying of data, the first things that comes to mind is the data factory capabilities. So within that, we have the pipelines. So that is more in line with the data factory service in Azure, not exactly, but similar. And then we also have the data flow side. And both of those toolings are very low code, almost no code tooling that we have available. But of course, we could also use notebooks for copying data. That is also another option. If we're doing just simple copy with pipelines, we have a copy activity that is very easy to use when you are not doing any transformations or anything like that. That is a great option to use. And then for the data flows, we have fast copy as an option. And as said, these two tools are, of course, very low-code tools. On the data flow side, we can, of course, use the M language to define our transformations as well. So we do have that option too over there. But compared to notebooks, where we are just using full code, it is lower code, at least compared to that. So there is quite a bit of options that with the notebooks, you can really do whatever you want, whatever you can do with code. You have a lot of options on how to do that. On the pipelines and data flow side, we are very much reliant on connectors and the different activities that they provide. So it's a good idea to get familiar with the different activities that are available for each of these, and then also the scheduling capabilities and differences between the two of these. All right, so again, we've covered some of these, but since we don't have too much time, we will go on to the next area, which is the semantic model side. So this has both aspects of designing and building semantic models, as well as optimizing enterprise scale semantic models. So on this side, if we think about it, we remember that we got a semantic model when we create a lakehouse. That is the default one, but of course we can create custom ones as well. We have a few storage modes that we can use here. So we can use direct query, which goes to the source and does the querying there. We have import that imports the data to the semantic model itself, to the service, moves it necessarily, one would say. And then we now have the direct lake option if you have your data in Fabric. So that brings a lot of performance benefit in a lot of cases. But we do need to have, even though it uses the Delta Lake files directly, we need to have a lakehouse or a warehouse created. So if it has to default back to direct query in some cases, then it's able to do that. If we look at the semantic model side, there is a few ways in which we can, like there's a lot of things in the requirements that we're going through. One of them is kind of using external tools. So when you work with semantic models, you might be used to working with DAX Studio or Tabular Editor as well. So those were actually some of the requirements. So get a little familiar in what are the different capabilities for these, what do they provide, and what do they not provide. So for example, Tabular Editor, you can do batch editing of measures and things like that. We also need to get familiar with how to create star schemas. And I will kind of assume that everybody, at least on some level, knows what those are. We have our fact and dimension tables. And so, for example, what you might want to focus on here is understanding logical versus physical relations. And then also understanding when we might need large semantic model support as well. If our model becomes very, very large, then that would be something that we might need to enable on our workspace level. And note that that does require premium licensing. Also, another aspect that you might want to focus on is active versus inactive relations as well, and how do they change how you work with your data. And I should be stopping in 2 minutes, right? All right, so I will just fly past the very last bit here. Actually, in this last area, we kind of come back to the previous slides and take that and implement it. So for example, we query using the SQL endpoints. And then on the semantic model side, there is the addition of using the XMLA endpoint to query data. Actually, the external tools already use those. So that is kind of what is needed behind the scenes. And you can, of course, use that to query your data with SQL Server Management Studio, for example. So there you might want to look at how do you set it into either read-only mode or read-write mode on the other hand. All right, we kind of breezed through that very last section here. So in the 1 minute before we finish, I would like to just give a few little quick tips for the exam that I would recommend you to do to be really well prepared. So first of all, go through the skilled measured list. You will then know what you do not need to study, and you will know what do you need to actually study. There's a lot of nice blogs and videos. I will put the links in the chat when I finish, so I don't go over time for that. There's a really good video series in YouTube, for example, that helps you go into all of the topics in detail. I would also take a look at the question types for the exam if you've never done a Microsoft exam before. So again, there is a resource here for the question types on the exam that has actually videos of each of those. So that will help you get in the right mentality for the exam for sure. I will also share the link for that. And then I would also recommend, since there is nowadays the practice assessments available on the Learn page, I would recommend looking at those as well, because then you get a little bit of a sense of what are the questions like, and you will be at least more confident heading into the exam as well. And they have a pool of questions, so if you do it once, you could do it a second time. You might get some same questions, but you also might get some different ones. So that is a good resource as well. So I will pop all of those resources in the chat once I finish. And so with that, I will say thank you so much for joining for this very swift breeze through these topics. I hope someday I can do like at least double time on this to do this session, since it is so much ground to cover. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or on Twitter or the former Twitter. And yeah, if you have any questions, please, you can put them in the chat and I can answer them on the chat as well. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.